Welcome to Our College, Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. This week, we have 2 episodes for you. These episodes are the first of our series of conversations with colleagues from around the state about the book So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. We'll be bringing you the conversations mostly in their entirety, editing only for flow and where participants requested that something not be placed in the public conversation. I want to thank everyone who participated in these conversations. These talks are hard, but we must have them if we're going to dismantle systemic racism in our country and in our college. I invite you to think through these conversations with us. And if you find yourself uncomfortable, I encourage you to sit with the discomfort. Don't walk away from it. If we're going to make change, we all have to get a little uncomfortable.
The quote I'm going to start with chapter 5, which is entitled, What is Intersectionality and Why Do I Need It?, is on page 76, and it is actually a question. She says, how do our social justice efforts so often fail to help the most vulnerable in our populations? She gives an answer, but I think it would be nice for us to discuss this question in light of what we've read so far and the concepts that she talks about in section 5 or in chapter 5 on intersectionality. So that's where I would like for us to start today.
I was not here for the first session, so I'd love to hear from everyone just again, sort of maybe a brief review of what they think intersectionality is. My impression was that it was talking about how we are very complex individuals and based upon where we just grew up, nothing that we did ourselves, just our environments and the things that had happened to us and things that we collected throughout our life, that we have a lot of different areas that you could look at that where we are more not privileged, should I say, that we are not privileged in those areas. But I'd love to hear from everybody else, maybe that would help me sort of think about that social justice efforts.
When I think about this, I think that we do not have monolithic identities. And one of the things that I was hoping that she would address in this chapter, but didn't, was things that are hidden. Like, we don't know who's experienced trauma. We don't know who has an autoimmune disease and looks fine, but really isn't. And so I was wondering if I'm the only one who thought that was missing, or what you think about those hidden identities that we have that aren't really talked about.
I so agree with you, Tammy. When I looked at that, part of it seemed almost like we were taking people in sort of a 2-dimensional viewpoint. And to me, one of the joys of meeting people and when you travel and you go different places is listening. And that's where you start to hear that which they want to reveal. But I sort of always think of people as that iceberg, where the biggest part of the iceberg is hidden from us and we will never know.
And Tammy, I didn't think about it, but I agree with your thought that, I don't know if she didn't discuss it, or if I just didn't go deep enough into thinking about it, that it really is about the intersectionality really does talk about who we are as a whole person, and making sure that as we're thinking about social justice efforts, that we are thinking about whole identities. So cognitive differences, physical differences, sexual differences, all of those kinds of things. And a lot of those aren't visible. And I do think that's a good point, because when we can't see it, my mom's parenting philosophy was out of sight, out of mind. If she wasn't looking at us, she didn't need to be responsible for us and didn't need to worry about us. And so that is, I think it's easy to fall into that trap when we do social justice work. If we don't see something, we don't necessarily do the work that needs to be done to help someone. And I was thinking about it in light of the podcast this morning. Obviously, the podcast is an audio format, but we have students who can't hear. And we don't offer transcripts of every episode of the podcast. And that is a gap that I need to fill. And just because we don't see as many hearing impaired students doesn't mean we don't have them. I know we have them, and I've got to close that gap as I do social justice work.
Part of this is maybe a question of, as she speaks to, of representation, that those with more representation and privilege, those tend to be the issues that get talked about more so in social justice. Tam, your comments remind me a little bit of something Roger Ebert said, the film critic, the thumbs up, thumbs down guy. When he became ill towards the end, he started talking about illness and how society, American society, we like to make illness invisible. And we don't have the representation of that. It's kind of one of a number of different ways in which intersectionality or different aspects of identity can be kind of pushed to the side, where people don't see it, out of sight, out of mind, and don't talk about it.
And I think there's a level, just the stigma of an illness, and am I going to lose my job? All of that factors in. And you're right, we don't talk about it. And it's just another piece of this intersectionality for me. It's not a criticism of the author. I think she makes some great points. I think it just necessitates further discussion and thinking about it.
To really look at the question of how do our social justice efforts fail to help the most vulnerable populations, I think for me, something that I realized in how I was failing was in the media that I was consuming. When we're constantly consuming media from one source, we're really missing a bigger picture. And so I've really worked to focus on finding media outlets that focus on intersectionality and focus on giving voices to other people. And that's helped me to really see where I'm falling short.
I'm also thinking about when we talk about women's pay, we often focus on the 78 cents to the dollar, but that's for white women. It's not for Black women or Latina women. So when I'm thinking about intersectionality, often we're thinking about the group with the most privilege. So we're thinking about white women and how much they make, but not everyone knows how much other women of color are making. So that often gets erased, but it's not that it's not important. It's just, there's not as much privilege for that group, and it kind of gets pushed to the side because of that. And I was thinking about that. I don't know if you guys watch Blackish, but there's an episode where the mom is part of a women's group, but kind of figuring out that not everyone is equally represented in this women's group, even within that. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about when we're talking about things getting missed within social justice efforts when we're talking about intersectionality. And I'm sure it's like that for other groups too. Or I'm also thinking about the LGBTQ groups and which groups are largely represented and which ones aren't as talked about too.
Manny, I'd like to build on your comment. On page 74, she says, I'm going to read a fairly long section here. White women will heap praise on my words, calling for the destruction of the patriarchy, and then turn around and ask why I have to be so divisive, or say dismissively that I sound like Al Sharpton when I dare bring up race. And I'm going to skip forward in that paragraph just a little bit. And even though Black Lives Matter was founded by Black women, even though Black women have been at the heart of every feminist movement in this country's history, nobody marches for us when we are raped, when we are killed, when we are denied work and equal pay. Nobody marches for us. And that is, I think it's, for me, that is one of the most powerful sections in this whole book, to remember that we have to fight for everyone, even if we don't necessarily see them represented.
Intersectionality was actually coined by a Black woman because of the unique experience that Black women were facing. Yeah.
Kimberly Crenshaw.
Who is alive and well and on Twitter, as far as I found. So if you're not following her, please do.
I will link to her Twitter account in the show notes.
Kara, I guess my next question was, as we were looking that we've all been talking about the intersectionality, is what exactly does everyone feel the author means when she says social justice? To me, that's a term that means so many things to so many different people based upon their experiences. Some focus more on the social piece, thinking social services. Some focus more on the justice piece, thinking the courts and police. I didn't know, as everyone was reading, when they heard that word and as she talks about it, what did you feel that it meant?
I think about policy. When I'm thinking about social justice, I'm thinking about those policies that are making it possible for everyone in society to have equitable access to everything that they need. And so if my job as a social justice activist is to fight for any of those things, then I am pursuing social justice for whatever group it is that I'm trying to get policy change for, because we can't make anything improved or better if we don't get the policies in place to ensure that those things are being set in stone for whatever marginalized groups are being affected.
Octavia, can I build on that to add that it has to also go to the only word that's coming to mind is enforcement of those policies. That may not be the right word, but
right.
Policies without action, and we have a lot of those, don't really matter.
Right. Absolutely.
It's a great definition. I love that.
I think we can also think about, when I think of policies, I automatically think government. I'm like, oh, well, I can't effectively change that. But also thinking about like our classroom policies as a way to be effective. Or I'm also a practicum student, so I'm a therapist too. But like, you know, what policies do we have for childcare for working moms or single moms? Like, how are other organizations organizing their policies, or what structures do they have in place to make sure they're serving the needs of everybody, especially those who are marginalized?
I think our grading policies can really be brought into this, because like the plagiarism policies of Ivy Tech usually involve bringing in administration. And I was thinking about, you know, the school to prison pipeline and how I'm complicit. And it's very tempting if you have a student that plagiarizes repeatedly to bring in a vice chancellor. But I've been reflecting lately on maybe using more of a restorative justice approach rather than a retributive justice, and just encourage. I could even try something like, you know, putting up an announcement that says, 2 people plagiarized their papers. If they will publicly step forward and apologize to the community, I will not turn them in or penalize them in any way. All they need to do is acknowledge the effects of plagiarism, and we will welcome them back to the community. I don't know, I'm still reflecting on this, but I think our policies about plagiarism may be part of this problem.
Julie, I have to really agree, because I ended up this past spring, as we went to all virtual, is that we had some brand new students who started the very second 8 weeks. And it was obvious the student, even though we said you're plagiarizing, this is what's going to happen, this is too similar, the student had no idea what we were talking about. That word was just foreign to them. So we actually did sort of a mini intervention to talk with the student and work with them with that. And so, I mean, I think that's a prime example of just what you're saying, where normally you just wrote them up and they still kept doing it. I mean, obviously the student really had no idea what we were talking about.
I have to agree with that. I had a student once who flat out, like, I showed him, this is plagiarism. I highlighted where it was plagiarized. He flat out thought he was doing it correctly. Like, it's not even that he didn't understand plagiarism. He understood what plagiarism was, and he was convinced he was doing it correctly, and just didn't understand how the ideas applied to what he had written.
Right.
And I think if we had gotten the chancellor involved, I don't think he would have learned anything, and then he would have been out of ideas.
Right. He would have learned something, which is that the deck is stacked against his success rather than supports his success. I realize this isn't directly just address race. It's affects a whole group of people, but
Well, I think this portion of the discussion is a microcosm of what she's talking about. The group here is those who voluntarily come to college with hopes of creating a better life for themselves, an opportunity, but they're just ill prepared, and it's very easy. And I think that's the heart of a lot of it. It's very easy to just chalk it up to, well, they should have known better, and then replace them with a new student or something. But it's that time that you invest to get to know the person, the situation, and fully, learn about them when we make these, have these aha moments. I had one as well this week. I won't share the entire anecdote, but the point is, I think it's done nothing but continue to prove to be the best way to resolve issues is when you finally just listen and understand another. And I think that's, again, at the heart of why she brings up intersectionality in this way.
In a number of my English classes, at the beginning of the semester, often ask students to write about their previous English courses or previous writing experiences. And it always kind of shocks and maybe even angers me a little bit when I read story after story of students describing having very authoritative teachers, almost brutally so, and teachers that are also dismissive of them as individuals and as thinkers. And it has me thinking, like, how terrified some of these students might be just to go to college in a new space, and are they expecting that type of attitude within the classroom to continue, even with higher education?
I think it's especially with higher education. As an advisor, they all start with me, right? So I see them first. And I have a huge responsibility to see the whole student. I don't get to pick just their English brain or just whatever. I have to get the whole person. And my background is in K-12 education. That's where I started before I came to working in higher ed. And something that you get a lot of when you learn and teach pedagogy is that you have these teachable moments. You have a responsibility as an educator to see the opportunity for a student to learn something that's not just your content. Part of the reason our students plagiarize or whatever it is that they're dealing with in the classroom is that they genuinely don't know and they're scared to ask because our K-12 system has moved so much to teaching to the test, and they're not taught those same skills necessarily. And so we get them into an environment where we're expecting them to know them already, and they don't know, and they don't feel comfortable asking because some of the people around them do seem to know what's going on.
That's an issue of class.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is an issue of class and just general understanding. And so and I know that it's easier for me because I see them one-on-one to step back and be able to look at the whole person than, maybe in a classroom setting. It's harder to do that. But I always feel like I have a huge responsibility to really get to know the student, the individual, what's going on in their life and how it's shaping what goes on our campus.
I have a comment, and it may not be well received, but as I'm listening to everybody, it seems like nobody is talking about race anymore. And I'm just putting it out there. It's not that people are making, the comments are great, and these are all things that we need to think about. But I have not, in the last few minutes, heard anything about race. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
No, it's a very truthful observation. A very truthful observation.
A way to kind of maybe segue back to intersectionality after that comment. I just mean like as a way, maybe I can get us there. I don't know. Yeah. In the class that I teach, one of the questions we ask in reflective writing is just, who am I? And so some students will stay at that surface level. Others will really start to kind of get down and share those kind of invisible things. And even just giving kind of me a little bit more background in this chapter, I'd be able to kind of explain some things differently to the students. But I think one thing that they really, I don't think it surprised me, but they said, no one's ever asked me that before. They see me for who I am when I walk in the room, but they don't really want to know everything about me. And so some of them do stay at that surface level because they figure someone doesn't really care to know. But those that really kind of get it, and they'll really say, thank you so much for even asking this. No one has ever wondered this or took the time to kind of listen or read about me in this way. And I've noticed that one of the things we talk about a lot is the different roles people have in life. So we start with student because everyone's at least in that class, but then we kind of are parsing these, I'm a parent, I'm a student, I'm an employee. We start to parse these things out because we're talking about prioritizing and how to balance these different life roles. But as an instructor, it would be really good for me to then bring it back around to how do these actually all engage with each other, and kind of be able to think about who am I in these roles individually, but really how does my experience in the classroom or at work, how do they affect each other? So kind of to be able to bring intersectionality back in a different way, perhaps for students as well, but introducing even the notion of it for those who aren't aware, which I think there would be quite a few that do just the parsing out of things and don't look at an individual for everything that is really wrapped up in us.
I think in this chapter, she's not only talking about race, though. She states on page 75, racial privilege is not the only form of privilege in our society. So while the majority of the book, she's talking about race, she really wants us to dig down and understand that that's not the only privilege that we need to be aware of and to think about as we're going into these situations. And any of those experiences of intersectionality can impact a student's education, which she points out a number of times. You don't have a parent to advocate for you because they've been through the same system, or they're working too many jobs, or whatever the case may be, that's going to play out in the classroom. And if we're not viewing that behavior or performance through the lens of equity and understanding of privilege, we're missing the mark.
Something that listening to this conversation has made me think about is, as you all know, I'm addicted to our student success commitments at the college. And it's made me think about that as we take an opportunity to, reassess those and make sure that they're still right for us, that we probably need to start with one for faculty and staff about the power that we have, and for students about the agency that they have. And so this has been a discovery moment for me as I've just listened to this conversation, that we didn't frame the student success commitments through an equity lens. And I think we have a lot of opportunity to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and expand our conversation to chapter 6, which is entitled, Is Police Brutality Really About Race? And I had a very difficult time selecting one place to talk about and start in this chapter, because there's more. I've highlighted more in this chapter than I didn't highlight, but I'm going to start with a quote from page 95. Just about every police officer that a person of color encounters will be armed, not just with a gun, but with the full force of a justice system that has shown just as much bias against people of color as the police have. So let's talk about the question that she starts the chapter with. Is police brutality really about race?
Maybe I'll start us out. I sort of feel like I'm in two worlds. I actually live in Cincinnati, which, as you know, is a large urban community. But I teach in Lawrenceburg, which is a small Indiana community. And with criminal justice, I'm very involved with all of the police and everyone that's in that area. And to me, I had a lot of difficulty with this chapter as they're talking about it, because most of the officers all of the officers that I know in Indiana are focused on helping people. They would immediately, when I have them come into class and we just start about talking about what's in their uniform as an indication of what do they do in their job, it's about, having a knife to cut down the dog or that's gotten away or hung up someplace, or how to unlock your doors or things like that. But of course, in a metropolitan area, in an urban area, you would not call the police to unlock your doors or to cut something down. So to me, it's very hard when I listen to this that it was lumping an awful lot of things together that were so very, very different. So again, I had difficulty with this chapter.
She says somewhere in here, and I can't find the exact quote right now, but she talks about how it is completely 100% possible for the police to be helpful to some communities and not helpful and even harmful to other communities.
And I think it goes back to from chapter 1, I think, where she talks about just that opening question of, is it about race? And she gives those 3 specific rules that I'm going to quickly try to find. She says, it's about race if a person of color thinks it is about race. It is about race if it disproportionately or differently affects people of color. And it is about race if it fits into a broader pattern of events that disproportionately or differently affect people of color. And Catherine, I struggle with it because I have police officers in my family who are good people, and a couple of them are social justice advocates, and they march in Black Lives Matter rallies. I mean, they are trying to do the work, but they acknowledge that they're part of a system that does not serve people of color like it should. And what I really appreciated about her conversation in this chapter is, and I think this is interesting, especially right now in light of the defund the police conversation, that's not the argument she advocates for. She actually advocates for a police force that protects everyone equally, or at least that was my perception of her argument. And I think that's actually what's at the heart of the defund the police narrative. It's just that 3-word phrase doesn't represent the argument very well. It's to people who work in policing and those sorts of things, it can be very threatening. And that's not really what it means. It's let's serve people the way they need to be served. Or again, that's my perception of it.
Yeah. I'm going to try and keep this as related as possible, but this was, a very intriguing chapter. I'm teaching English 111 online. I've got a number of students who are interested in this topic, this general idea. And so I have helped a few students find some sources, and I learned a term that some of you may be familiar with, which I'm going to throw it in the chat. Broken window policing. Does anyone know what that refers to? And I'm not going to teach anyone right now what it's about, but I just want to express that an article I read about that, a sort of heavy duty article from the Georgetown Law Review, really made it kind of laid out how this system that I think this author of our book is describing is trying to make clear to the reader. It's she's aware that there are people who don't get randomly pulled over for being white, all right, or whatever. She understands that this doesn't happen to every group, but she's also open to the idea that it could be just coincidence. However, I think what she's trying to let you understand is that there is a very clear, consistent, and obvious pattern, and it needs to be recognized. And once it's recognized, then we can start to see how there is. This is an example of social injustice. It's not. It's police who are using all of their rights in a way to victimize or vilify people who aren't problems in society, but it's a construct that's hurting them, and I think making this equitable level playing field virtually impossible.
If you look on the bottom of page 92, this is not to say that the majority of our police officers are racist, hateful monsters. When looking at anti-Black bias in police actions, we are looking at the product of police cultural history that has always viewed Black Americans as adversaries, and of a popular culture that has always portrayed Black Americans as violent criminals not worthy of protection. That's what she's talking about in this section. It's not the whole thing of, all police are bad or whatever the case may be. It's looking at the historical construction that caused police to exist in the United States in the first place. The reason why police forces were established was to capture fugitive slaves. And then once Reconstruction hit, then it turned into controlling Black people. And that idea of control and keeping them in their place and putting their knees in their necks, just to bring it contemporary, is the culture that we are dealing with right now. So as a Black woman with Black sons, every time my boys leave the house, I'm horrified that something could happen to them. And that comes from this culture that has been built up. And I'm sorry to people who are friends with police officers and they know police officers who do well. I do too. But the statistics show us that historically, as soon as that visual of Black skin is seen, it's not, oh, let me help you. It's, oh, you're getting ready to do something wrong. And that's what we need to be working to get rid of.
And Octavia, I think about that in terms of the environment that I know, which is education. And we'll talk about the school to prison pipeline today, and then we'll talk about the education system in a future episode. It's interesting because if I have a critique of the book, it's that she gives education way too much of a pass. She lets us off really easy because we don't even get that historical foundation of the anti-Black sentiment that founds education too in this country, where she gives us that with policing. And it was really eye-opening for me to understand and connect that history in that way. And she doesn't do that for education. And that's one of my biggest concerns about the book, is that I think we got off easy and we don't deserve that.
I want to point out too that police brutality extends beyond the physical violence that you see. Octavia, you just got incredibly emotional talking about your boys, and that's a horrible response for you to have, and that makes me that breaks my heart in a million pieces for you. But that's brutality as well. Like that's an extended part of the system and the brutality. And so clearly it is about race. Clearly. And there's just more to that story than the physical violence. It's the history and the backstory that builds that emotional response. And that, I was a 16-year-old at one point, and I was rowdy, and I probably should have been pulled over more than once in my life for being stupid. And I wasn't, and if I was, would I have I wouldn't have been pulled out of my car. It makes my heart hurt so much to see you have that response, Octavia. So I really appreciate you sharing, but it's clear that it's so much more.
Emotional brutality.
Yeah,
it is.
What I think she's getting at with this chapter is that cumulative effect weighs on people the second they have to walk out their door, or their family has to walk out the door. And I don't have an easy answer for that other than to listen. And I don't know how to, I feel like I want to make it better, but it's overwhelming. And how do we get that word out there? I have the privilege, my son can walk out the door, and I don't think about that.
I also think about, she talks about how the pervasiveness of video has at least drawn attention to the issue of police brutality against people of color. And I tried to find the reference last night because I knew we would be discussing this chapter, and I couldn't, but I saw someone posted on Instagram that a white person had seen a police officer pull over a Black person. And this white person pulled over behind them and got out of their car and walked up to the situation because they wanted to be a witness just in case. And it was interesting because the person of color who posted on Instagram is like, don't do this. This is stupid. It was dangerous. And that should not be our reaction. That should never have to be our reaction. And I realize that it's very valid and very truthful. And I don't know that I have the courage to take that action, and I should. I feel like that's the kind of thing we're going to have to do if we're going to change the system.
And I think she points that out. It's a system. It's not
a
bunch of individual racists.
Right.
It's a system, and it's the system that has to change.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask you, does anybody feel that the departments in their area are trying to change? Again, it didn't get this way overnight, so it's going to take a while to move it. Does anyone feel that there are things that are being done in their community? Because we talk about policies that set them in motion.
Living in Indianapolis, I don't think so yet. I'm not convinced. Now, I live in Lawrence, and one of the things that Lawrence has that I think is good are body cams for every officer that are activated as soon as they get out of the car. And I think that that is a really important step to try to change the culture within the system. But it's not enough in Indianapolis proper yet, from what I've seen.
I kind of agree. I think there's maybe kind of general lip service, maybe a banning of chokeholds here and there, but still a lot of policy work needing to be done, and perhaps even a defensiveness to some of the criticisms. Hopefully that will, a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
Jody and I live in the greater Louisville area, so we're having many, many things that should be done that aren't being done. And it's a not a unique situation, which is unfortunate that this just keeps happening. But it doesn't feel like anything is happening. It doesn't feel like anything is being done. The city of Louisville outlawed the no-knock warrants, but that felt like a
Band-Aid.
It didn't feel like anything. It doesn't feel like the victory that anyone is looking for. It's not. There's so much more that needs to happen, and it's not happening.
I was just going to say a lot of that change for police stations everywhere, police officers, just has to do with, having a better relationship with the people in the communities that they serve, and to, have that training about, racist abuse that comes in the form of implicit bias, microaggression, or whatever. And I know that one of the things that worked fairly well in Indianapolis in some of the neighborhoods, and I don't live in Indianapolis, I live in Anderson, but there are a lot of relationships there. The coalition, the 10-point coalition, and where people in the communities are establishing relationships and also, looking out for what's happening in their communities. And in those areas where the community and the police are actively working together, you see a reduction in, the number of arrests and those kinds of things that are going on, because people in the communities know the people in their communities. And so they can, be there and out in the street and, making sure kids, are able to play or do whatever. And I think that it takes both of those things. The community has to have that relationship, and police officers need to have, from the first day, that training to ensure that any potential biases that they may be coming in with, you need to name them and claim them. And then you need to actively say, I'm not going to let that affect the way that I police communities. And that takes, training and all of that kind of work. And it was mentioned earlier, this has been ongoing for so long that it's going to take a long time for it to get back together. But I think as citizens, that is our responsibility. Not so much that, hey, I'm going to walk up during the traffic stop, because I would never want anybody to do that. God, that scares me to death. But to, have a relationship and to do community events and those kinds of things, and also to hold our departments accountable for, whatever people are calling cultural competency or whatever. It's basically teaching officers how to not be racially abusive to Black and brown.
And then what's our role in that as an institution, impacting another institution, as we train students to go into criminal justice? Are we teaching about, and I honestly don't know, maybe we are, the history of the police force? Is that common knowledge of when our students graduate, they know how police forces originated, and they know about the the school to prison pipeline and all of that. Is that something we're teaching actively?
Yes. So since I teach that,
Awesome.
so yes, yes. And particularly I like what Octavia said is that we have to really work on people, knowing who they are and owning it, knowing their biases and owning them. And we cover that in a particular class and we focus on it throughout. And that's why as I was listening, I didn't want everybody to leave with thinking nothing is being done, nationwide. Many, many national agencies are providing sample changes in policies. Different states are doing it. Different localities are doing it. And just like Octavia said, we have community policing it's sort of an old way that's returning to really talk about getting involved in the community. And we have citizens oversight boards. And every community is kind of doing something a little differently that works best for their community. But I will say one of the big things, because I'm on the curriculum committee, so I can speak for all of the other criminal justice programs. We really focus on, I think one of the most important things is critical thinking, that we listen first and you evaluate what a situation is. However, just like when many of you were saying, oh no, you wouldn't, if somebody was stopped, you would not want to get out. Thank you. Please don't do that. An officer who is making a stop, remember, that's one of the most dangerous things for everyone involved is when there's a stop. And you're coming up behind an officer. Oh, you have created a very bad situation for everyone involved. So please don't do that. That would be a terrible thing to do. Don't do that. If you want to sit there with your camera out, that's fine. But for goodness sakes, keep your hands out so they can see what you're doing. And that's for everyone. But yes, Ivy Tech is definitely teaching all of those issues.
Great. Good. So let's expand our conversation to add into chapter 7, which is how can I talk about affirmative action? And I went to page 113. So affirmative action is a term thrown around wildly in conversation about race, usually by those who are firmly on the, and I quote, there is no racism, there is only reverse racism. Affirmative action is racism against white people, unquote, crowd. When not used as argument, it's used as an insult. Oh yeah, you're just an affirmative action hire. But for all the talk, for all those who tear it down and all those who try to defend it, not many people fully understand affirmative action. And I struggled a little bit with this chapter. I think because I don't fully understand affirmative action, I think this is one of my takeaways is I have a lot more learning to do here about affirmative action. So let's dive into this chapter and add to our conversation with chapter 7.
So do we want to start with what affirmative action, the plan, what the goal was? And I sort of have to disclaim that I got hired a lot of times because of affirmative action of trying to hire women. There was about a decade in there where that was a big push. And I was hired and I was told I was hired because I was a woman and people would make comments and things along those lines. Now, that is not the same as a race issue, but I'm just saying affirmative action, to me, the goal was to try to get people, if you think of it in the pipeline, earlier so they could rise up into supervision because of the not hiring of people based upon whatever bias that is with affirmative action, that you then have so many years behind everyone, you'll never reach that supervision, management, or policy making frame. So the goal with affirmative action was to get people in the pipeline sooner. I don't know what everybody else's thoughts were.
I think what affirmative action was and what affirmative action is are different things. She talks a lot about it being scaled back to being, now when people think of affirmative action, I think people often think about it being like a quota and you have to hit your quota of XYZ population of people. And that's the way it was established, not the way it was intended. It was about representation and bringing people in and recruitment efforts and education efforts and things. And that's not how affirmative action is viewed at all now. And it's really not the way it is approached, just because it's been scaled back so far. It is something that worked. And I just don't know that it's working as well now.
I mean, I know affirmative action to be more for like universities. That's how I like was taught it was about. So I didn't know the historical context of it so much. But I'm in a PhD program at Purdue, and right now our program's talking about having more Black students and students of color in our program. But kind of one of the problems is that like students of color in our program aren't really supported very well, and are graduating with more time. And like, it's a lot harder to be in academia already because academia is a very white institution, and there's all these problems. So it's like, yes, you can recruit these students, but how are you actually supporting them? It's kind of how I'm seeing maybe affirmative action moving. I think it's great to recruit, but you also need to be able to support those same students if you're going to be recruiting them to institutions too.
I can't remember, Manny, if it was Mia Johnson or Chris Cathcart that said in the episode a few weeks ago when we were talking about race and racism that they just sort of cringe at the idea of us recruiting faculty from historically Black colleges and universities, because Ivy Tech is not built to support them as faculty members. We don't have that kind of environment. So I think it goes both ways. It's not only students, it's also the faculty and staff. What do you still want to know about affirmative action? We're not real talkative in this chapter, and I wonder if that's because we're just not as comfortable or as confident. What do you still have questions about?
I think one of the difficult things is with affirmative action is that there's so many pieces of it. There's kind of the legal piece of it that we need to get a percentage, and everybody is trying. When you said quota, it's usually a percentage that they're looking for at a certain time. But on the other hand, every business, knows that it is an advantage to have wide diversity of all sorts of areas within their business, because that helps bring in new and innovative ideas and looking at products and selling and markets and needs of people from different viewpoints. Just like we keep talking, there's all these hidden things that people have. And that unless you bring people of differences together, you don't get the benefit of all of their creativity that's in there. So to me, one of the big pluses of affirmative action, you get different people's points of views from their life experience.
Another one of the issues that you run into, and I think this is from just the history of how affirmative action has been viewed, it kind of has started carrying, or it carried this negative connotation with it. Mm-hmm. And so that makes people uncomfortable to even, mention the words affirmative action. And it's like she mentioned, it ultimately is about getting a variety of people in the room, mm-hmm. and making sure that those folks who may not have as much representation, say, in the community or at college or whatever, but that they have that representation, because we know, particularly in education, how important it is for our students to be exposed to as many different types of whatever you call it as possible, because then that makes them more effective when they go out into the work world. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues that ultimately happens when you have some of those recruitment efforts, then the conversation turns into, well, they needed somebody who was differently abled, and that's why you're here. They needed, a woman, or they needed somebody Black, or they needed, somebody who's Latinx or whatever. And it's never about the skills. Mm-hmm. Maybe I just have the skills. Right. And you got lucky because I'm a woman, I'm Black, and I'm dope. Rolled into one.
That's right.
So I love that.
But because of the fact that, it's, you're just looking for people who can do the things that have a variety, and affirmative action having that negative connotation with it, and people don't always want to use the language. And it boils down to recruitment and taking the idea that the highest privilege is not the litmus. That's not the standard. Everybody brings their own standard of excellence. And why am I meeting this criteria? And why does this have to be the criteria that I have to meet? If I can come in and I can do the work, or if I can teach the class, or if I'm an excellent student, or if I need additional resources because I come from a community where there was not enough access to certain types of things. But if you give me a chance to have access to those things, whatever those resources are, then that gets me to the place. And that goes back to what Amanda was saying about, you have to have the support there. So if, as a faculty member or a staff person or whatever, who is outside of whatever the standard privileged class is, we have to do the work to make sure, one, that we stop doing this and saying, this is the thing that you have to meet, and saying, what are all of the things that we can bring to make us all dope as an organization, all awesome together. And we just have to reframe our thinking so much on all of these things because it's been ingrained in us for so long. And, that's the other part of it, that the psychological, that we have to work on that part first. I talked for a long time and I apologize.
Don't apologize. That was great.
Good stuff. I don't know if it was in this chapter or another chapter where she reframed the phrase that we use is achievement gap. And it's really less about an achievement gap than an opportunity gap.
Yeah.
And that puts the onus on the institutions. What are we doing to prevent people from having these opportunities? And rolling back affirmative action is probably a piece of that. And so it's not just, she has a quote on, I think, page 112 about the value of marginalized people is determined by how well they can scale often impossible obstacles that others will never know. And that's on the institutions, and that's on us not providing the opportunities. And I think that shift from achievement gap to opportunity gap really helps us reframe how we see institutional roles in what's going on.
I always keep thinking with us at Ivy Tech that this is going to be an important element of CCEC, who is really getting students prepared for careers, for interviewing. And to me, just like many of you were mentioning, people have talents and great skills that they need to be pushing forward, their strengths that they may well not have realized are such great strengths. I mean, to me, just having a lot of diverse experiences is going to certainly be a strength when I'm interviewing. And I'm just thinking, what a great opportunity we have from our advising all the way to getting our students a job, that we can really help them identify what those strengths are.
I'm curious about kind of where we're at now with kind of an era of mass unemployment, where the COVID and unemployment has kind of exacerbated inequalities in terms of types of jobs that have been hit, that have been wiped out. And I'm curious about affirmative action post-COVID. Will it be seen as an opportunity to strengthen affirmative action efforts, or will it be used as an excuse to kind of erode some of those motivations?
I don't know, but I was thinking about what happened to international students with the current administration visas all of a sudden. I don't know why that happened, but I was wondering if it was kind of this fear of the economy's not doing well. We don't want more people coming here taking jobs. I have no idea, but it made me think of that.
I also read something this morning sort of related to that, Jill, about the disparity that, white collar jobs, we can do them from home, whereas blue collar jobs, you can't. And we're creating this, because of that, we're creating this mobile versus non-mobile culture. And if you're able to be mobile and work remotely, you can keep working. But if you're not, you can't. And so that is, I think there are a ton of things tied up with race and class and just a ton of different things in that. And I still haven't unpacked it yet, but I found that a really interesting thought this morning as I think about what does a post-COVID world look like, assuming we get to the other side of this thing someday. I know we will, but not having a lot of faith today that we will.
I think this is a tangent, but one of the things that I think about with the survey that she talks about, where they didn't do such a great job creating that sense of belonging for people of other races. And how can we do better on that, or how might we? And how do we avoid the hidden workload for our people of color in a different institution? Obviously, we weren't where we needed to be, but then we had to have like our people of color serve on every possible committee, hiring committee, and the faculty of color were often tapped for things beyond their job instead of focusing on getting tenure. And I brought articles to the president and our diversity officer, and they both said, well, they're going to do it anyways. Even though I had the literature, I wrote a summary. And so are we doing the same thing? And then my second point is for CCEC, how can we avoid imposing our aspirations? Like, this is what I think you can do, rather than them being able to, any student being able to explore what they want to do, where not what their family wants them to do, not what we think they should do, but how to have those conversations. Yeah. So I went off on 2 tangents. But.
That's okay. All right, let's add chapter 8 to our conversation. We'll continue with affirmative action, but we'll add this. Chapter 8 is, what is the school to prison pipeline? And I purposefully chose a pretty caustic sentence from the chapter that I also think is, having come out of the public school system, that was my original training. I think there's truth in this sentence. So from page 124, our public school system sees Black and brown children as violent, disruptive, unpredictable future criminals. And as I picked this sentence out, I thought back to my K-12 teaching, and the students that I remember as pains in the neck, because sometimes that's just what they are, they were all white. And I just think about that in terms of, because I was very new to an inner city school. I had not had experience with classrooms that were mixed race before I got into my first teaching job. And what I remember is the kids with privilege, the kids with money, were the ones who were my biggest challenge, because they're like, well, my dad will take care of this for me. And it's an interesting observation as I think about this chapter, not necessarily relevant to the school to prison pipeline, but interesting reflection for me. So what else did you see in this chapter?
I mean, this chapter made me really sad. I knew this was a thing, but last year I did therapy at an elementary school, and it was a rural, predominantly white elementary school. But I think, I still had kids who were minorities that I worked with. They were identified as a problem or having ADHD, and they clearly didn't. It was just kind of like they had life going on, like other white children in their classroom were having difficulties adjusting, but they were identified as needing therapy, which I thought was strange. And I kind of struggled to see that and see what my role in elementary school was, because I'm not trained as a teacher, so I don't know. And I'm learning the school system and how things work and operate, and just working in special education and having to advocate for students and say, no, that's not what they need. That's not where they should be. They don't have this. You need to work through it, with teachers, and how hard to push with teachers who are burnt out. So I just really struggled with how do we fix this in a school system that's already really underfunded and over burnt out, and then adding this onto their plates when they're not getting funded, which is really important, and it's affecting children. It just made me really sad that this was happening to children when they were in second grade.
I wonder how necessary it is that we have police officers sitting in the reception area. I don't know what you do at other campuses, but at Madison, when you walk in the main entrance, you see a smiling woman sitting behind a desk, and then right next to her is a uniformed and armed police officer. And it's like we're telegraphing this message that, there's this, you're entering an institution that's being watched over by, I don't know, a quasi-military unit or something. I find it very intimidating. And I wonder if that's necessary. Octavia was talking about the importance of changing our community policing, and could we do that on our campuses? Could we have our security not wear uniform and not wear guns, and have them just walk around the campus instead of sitting behind a desk and hang out with students in the lounge and, you know, talk to the people smoking cigarettes out by the back door? And what do you think? Is it necessary to have this uniformed officer right by the front door?
I struggle with this so much because I struggle with having uniformed officers in K-12 schools. You know, I understand the fear of school shootings. I'm not a parent, so I can't understand it on that level. But I also have not yet seen a situation where a school shooting was stopped by an armed school resource officer. And so you ask a fabulous question, Julie. Is it necessary, or is it a response to a threat that we perceive that the solution we've chosen probably won't fix? It's a great question.
It almost seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy to put someone in a position like that, because then you immediately create this divide between power and the students, and to just remove their uniforms and have them walk around could really help.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that was very telling for me on this topic was that primarily school shootings are committed by white students, but the laws that have been enacted have very disproportionately affected children of color. And that to me was just like, all right, what we're doing isn't working. It's the wrong approach, and it's not going to work. We can't keep doing the same thing and expect to have a different outcome.
I think it's clear. I think this chapter, especially in this discussion, I think what maybe we are just now maybe realizing or understanding is that a uniformed police officer walking around creates for some people a sense of safety, and for others a sense of fear. And we just have to be in tune with that. And that, again, returns back to the sort of general theme of the book, is just this, being willing to understand how things are perceived by other people who don't look like you or are like you. And to Kara's comment, I was thinking of the same thing about how we've not heard of any stories where a SRO has stopped an incident. That's obviously going to be a choice that is made by the school and then, of course, the media. But I don't mean to be one of these media guys, but if you think about it, that's not going to sell newspapers. That's not a sexy thing to talk about. It's not, for all I know, it has happened. And that's even worse, is that we are so addicted to violence and images of violence that it's almost like consumers would rather see how this happens to promote their individual agendas, as opposed to celebrating how things that were planned to prevent awful things from happening worked. That's how it should be, but that's not going to sell. I always say sell newspapers, as if nobody buys newspapers anymore. That's not what's going to appeal to our culture, which is really a deeper, sadder issue.
Do we talk about how whether or not SROs stop school shootings? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Meanwhile, they're beating up a lot of Black students, and we've seen a lot of stories about that. This is something that we know happens in schools. And I almost feel like whether or not they stop school shootings, I don't think they do. I don't think they do. But meanwhile, they're causing a lot of harm.
Can I just throw in here? I don't know how many others of you have K-12 experience, classroom or in a staffing position. But when I read this chapter, it wasn't surprising. It didn't really relate to my position. That doesn't truly matter at the moment. But what I did connect to is how we talked about this sort of authoritative power that teachers either consciously are aware of or not, and how they are typically going to be more trusted as the source of information than the students, whether it's one or more. And so once that's picked up, they realize that if they don't simply like someone's behavior, their attitude, the way they dress, the way they wear their hair, they're going to look for ways to either have it corrected or have them removed eventually, or as often as possible. And as sad as that is, it applies to, I think, the issues she's discussing with race, but I think it also has to do with students with unidentified or not undocumented learning disabilities. There's so many other aspects about it that, it's just not, it's an issue that I'm not sure how it can be resolved unless you start having the same level of accountability without actually giving teachers body cams that you would with police and body cams. That transparency and maybe is something that needs to be more promoted to diffuse or circumvent, return back to these, this inequality that she describes in chapter 8.
I'd like to close our conversation today by sort of tying up a circle here. We started out today's conversation with social justice, and Octavia gave us a really wonderful definition that talked about policy and what it does. And at the end of chapter 8, the author gives us a list of factors that contribute to the school to prison pipeline. And there are several here, and I'm going to ask us to focus on one and talk about its relevance to us at Ivy Tech. And that is on zero tolerance policies. And we've already talked a little bit about policy, but where do we have zero tolerance policies or zero tolerance like policies at Ivy Tech, or even in our own practices that we need to think about changing?
Maybe attendance policies pre-COVID.
Yeah, we might have to say, you have to think about us before COVID, where, right now everything's a little loose, which is okay. I like it this way, but I used to say
there's just, syllabi are very punitive sounding often rather than inclusive. And there are strategies to change that. And are we providing enough professional development to really put these concepts that we're talking about into action and practice in what we do?
Academic second chances, and it's really more financial second chances. And obviously we're guided by federal regulations.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a tough one when students probably can handle it now, and you have they don't have documentation. Maybe they shouldn't have come right out of high school, or they had a bad K through 12 experience, and now they know how to ask for help and use the resources that are available, but we don't have a way to help them have that second chance. That's an opportunity gap right there.
Do we have a policy where they can ask for forgiveness for a semester with their grades?
For classes,
but not for financial aid.
Right.
And it won't impact even if they get exemptions from those grades, it's not going to impact their financial aid. So it's grades only. So if they need it to help them get into a nursing program or to help them graduate, fine, it impacts their grade, but it's not going to make them eligible for financial aid, which in essence makes them ineligible to return.
I think that's a place too, Jody, where we have to think too about what our power is at Ivy Tech. We have a different kind of power than most community colleges. And so do we need to go to the federal government and say, look, we need a carve out of aid dollars to help students who, for whatever reason, circumstances the first time didn't work, or go to private funders? Because I think in Indianapolis, we did an episode a few weeks ago on several of the second chance scholarship programs that are available out of the Indianapolis campus, and try to build more private funding for those sorts of programs.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, great point.
And how much are we heading off early on for some of the things, some of the needs that students have about information.
Yeah.
And, what all of the possibilities are that potentially could happen if, certain things happen to them, they have to leave, or, they have a bad semester, or about financial aid, or all of those kinds of things, because we have such a large first generation population. And I know we have kind of a standard, here's your orientation, but is that enough to make sure that all of the students are coming in really armed with information, so that, maybe instead of taking a full load, and I know, God, don't say it, but maybe don't take a full load, maybe take 2 classes, see how that goes, so you can get a feel for things. And then, we'll work on adding on to get you to that point. Yes, it's going to take them longer, but in the long run, that improves their experience. And our responsibility is to them. And if we don't have them, there is no us. And so it seems like we need to be doing more at the beginning to ensure that as they're going through progressing, then we can have improved persistence and, fall to fall persistence and those kinds of things, because we've done a lot of things early on up front to get them through as they're going along, and providing resources and all of that. And we always say, yes, we don't get enough money and this, that, and the other, but people who've been broke have been creative for years and years. So why can't we take our same creative energy to help students get things done when, our funding sources are stretched to capacity? And it takes the whole group to help those individuals, and we all have to be willing to do our part to get that done. And sometimes it does take a little bit more work or whatever, but I guess the question is, do we really want them to be successful or not?
Octavia, I think that is such a great point, because we have an amazing orientation, but I often think of that orientation like taking a person who's never seen a swimming pool before and tossing them in the deep end, because it's just so much information thrown at you so fast. It's not wrong. It's just simply the traditional way of doing it. And I think we've got to reimagine it in a way that's more customized and really gets to know the student. To build on something Jen said early in the conversation, she gets to see students on an individual one-on-one basis. And more, we've got to figure out how, as an institution, we see each student as an individual and apply those supports and those tools and resources to them to make sure that every single one of them can be successful, every single student we meet.
I think for students who are just kind of trying out college at Ivy Tech, it's really important for us as faculty, if we're teaching classes, to really make sure that we're showing students that we care and that they belong here, so that they feel included, where they might have had in their K through 12 education, not good relationships with teachers, or have felt really excluded, or felt like education wasn't for them. So just kind of making those side conversations and kind of going the extra mile to make sure we're checking in with students and seeing how things are going. Because sometimes I feel even in college classes, instructors can feel we shouldn't be that close to students, but it's different than high school, but it's not our job. So just kind of doing that. Because sometimes as an adjunct, I feel like I can't help them out with financial aid or help them figure that out, but I can help them kind of restructure how they think about education, and it helping them find a place where they feel like they belong or included in the class.
May I ask, or at the risk of maybe taking this in a completely different direction with less than 5 minutes to go, I'm just curious. I'm not questioning, central office at all whatsoever, but I have to.
I hope you actually are on a regular basis, Steve.
Well, internally, yes, but not on recorded Zoom.
Okay.
So I'm curious, I don't listen to mainstream radio or watch a lot of regular television, but I'm curious if our marketing campaign is still zeroing in on how fast a degree can be earned, as opposed to this shift to what we're talking about, and that's the focus on their success and our dedication to individualize our individual students. And because I don't mean to think that or suggest that any duping is taking place, but if you if we are still, or if any aspect of it is still like in only X amount of weeks, months, years, you can have this, and then these will happen. When that doesn't, they're going to lose confidence and maybe in the school, in themselves, and in in the value of education. So why, if it's happening, how else can it be approached? And I think there has been a recent push for like personal testimonials from either students or graduates about not say like promoting individual teachers, but like how our angle on education is different. You never hear IU or Purdue in only 4 years you'll have a bachelor. That's ridiculous, right? They don't take that approach. They don't need to recruit. So maybe just something to either discuss further next time. But again, I'm sorry to take over at the very end with that. Just didn't want to not say it before we ended.
It's a great comment. And we all know for many of our students, it takes more than 2 years to finish a certificate, even because they're taking one class at a time and they have to take 8 weeks or a semester off in order to finish because they're paying as they go. And that means they've got to take a semester, work a semester. And it's a reality we don't talk about often enough. All right, friends. Well, we will stop there. That was a great conversation. Thank you all so much again for being brave and coming on here and being vulnerable. Thanks, everybody. It was great to see everybody today.
Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can connect with me on Twitter at KNM Tweets. You can reach us by email at ourcollegeorvoices@ivytech.edu. Leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. Don't forget, if you're an Ivy Tech faculty or staff member, you can always join our Microsoft Teams listener community. Our website is ivytech.edu/podcast. Production assistance for this and every episode provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah Ferguson, and the Ivy Tech Community College marketing team. Our podcast concept is by Matthew Pittman. Theme music and post-production services are provided by Jen Eads at the Brassy Broadcasting Company. We'll talk to you next time on Our College, Your Voices.